That night, around 8 p.m., all the men gathered in the village hall. It was said that a ceremony to expel wandering spirits would take place. Mr. Village Head had invited a paranormal. There was nothing peculiar about the appearance of the shaman, according to the men. He was wearing a batik shirt. His face looked like that of an ordinary person. He also seemed friendly, shaking hands with all the men present. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Santoso, who will assist us," said Mr. Village Head. After the introduction, Mr. Santoso explained the method he would use to expel supernatural beings. "Do you all know sea salt?" Mr. Santoso asked. "Certainly, everyone knows that salt comes from seawater, but apparently that's not what Mr. Santoso meant. Sea salt is coarse salt, usually in the form of rough crystals like small pebbles, unlike iodized salt, which has a finer texture. Sprinkle sea salt around your houses, encircle all parts of the house," continued Mr. Santoso. "Indeed, it is said that people in the past used salt as a ward against evil spirits. It may sound strange because, besides repelling snakes, salt can also be used to ward off supernatural beings. But according to the beliefs of people in the past, this method was the most effective, much like the European culture that believes garlic can ward off vampires." After giving instructions to the villagers, Mr. Santoso then requested to be taken to the place where Mrs. Ratme passed away. That night, all the villagers accompanied him to the entrance of the cocoa plantation. "Right here is the place," said Mr. Village Head, pointing to the rambutan tree. Mr. Santoso closed his eyes, and his mouth seemed to be muttering a prayer or mantra. Perhaps about 5 minutes passed, and suddenly a strong wind shook the leaves, and a hint of a fishy smell wafted into the noses of the villagers. "He has arrived," Mr. Santoso whispered to Mr. Village Head. A figure of a woman wearing a red nightgown with flower motifs was seen sitting on one of the branches of the rambutan tree, facing away from the villagers. "Oh my God, look at that above," said one of the villagers. Mr. Santoso took out a keris from his bag, his mouth murmuring again. An unseen struggle occurred. Mr. Santoso's face appeared sweaty, and his breath seemed to be struggling. All the villagers looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what to do in such a situation. "Let's help by reciting prayers," commanded Mr. Village Head. Verses from the Quran flowed from the mouths of the villagers. Meanwhile, Mr. Santoso still appeared exhausted. The figure of the woman who was sitting on the branch of the tree now seemed to float down. This suddenly startled the villagers, and some even hurriedly went home out of fear. According to the villagers, the figure was indeed Mrs. Ratme. Her face looked pale with sunken black eyes. Even the villagers could still see the bruise marks on her neck from the rope that had strangled her when she died. Not long after, the figure turned around and floated towards the dark cocoa plantation, eventually disappearing from sight. Meanwhile, Mr. Santoso opened his eyes again, his body collapsing to the ground. It was evident that he was very tired. "Are you okay, sir?" Mr. Village Head asked, while helping Mr. Santoso to stand up. After returning from the scene where Mrs. Ratme passed away, Mr. Santoso was hosted at Mr. Village Head's house. Some remaining villagers, including my father, accompanied him, and with black coffee and Kretek cigarettes, the conversation unfolded. "This spirit still has unfinished business. She does not want to be expelled," said Mr. Santoso. "What kind of business, sir? Did she mention it?" asked one of the villagers. "She said let her handle it herself." "But if she wants to handle it herself, why is she terrorizing every villager in this village?" asked Mr. Village Head. "I still don't understand. She didn't tell me. Because she considers me not part of this village. She got angry and drove me away," replied Mr. Santoso. The expulsion turned out to be in vain, as it did not produce anything. Mr. Santoso raised his hands and surrendered. Mr. Village Head became more troubled, not knowing what to do next. Should he call another paranormal? But Mr. Santoso's message was for the villagers to be patient and wait for Mrs. Ratme's 40-day period to pass. Haven't been able to breathe a sigh of relief because the plan to expel Mrs. Ratme's ghost failed. Mr. Village Head was again puzzled by the disappearance of another resident of Tegel Sari. Tay Dewey, a singer who had gone missing some time ago, was now nowhere to be found. Before she disappeared, Dewey seemed strange, Mr. Village Head. Since being haunted by Ratme's ghost, she kept having nightmares. She locked herself in her room and refused to come out, said Mrs. Dewey's mother. But yesterday, when I returned from the fields, Dewey was seen tidying up her clothes. I thought she had a call for a performance. Because every time I asked, she wouldn't answer. I became suspicious that something was wrong with Dewey. Then what, ma'am? Mr. Village Head asked. Then, without my knowledge, she disappeared. That day, after hearing the report from Mrs. Dewey's mother, Mr. Village Head, accompanied by my father, went to the police station to report this missing person incident. The activities of the villagers in Tegel Sari were normal during the day, but as evening approached, everyone secluded themselves. Since Mr. Santoso's advice to sprinkle salt around the house, villagers were rarely haunted by Mrs. Ratme. But cries and apparitions often occurred, and if a villager was lucky, they could witness it. There was an incident. One night a villager saw Mr. Ratmo walking alone. He was carrying a bag with an unknown content. According to rumors, whether gossip or fact, Mr. Ratmo often visited his wife's grave at night. Maybe he still can't forget his wife, said Mr. Burren at the coffee shop that evening. But isn't Mr. Ratmo afraid? Well, it's his wife after all. Maybe the love is strong enough to dispel fear, replied Mr. Burren. So how was the ghost expulsion event yesterday? According to the wise person invited by Mr. Village Head, we have to wait until Mrs. Ratme's 40-day period is over. The conversation at the coffee shop that evening sounded quite intriguing. I, who was initially just passing by, ended up sitting and paying attention. Not long after, Mr. Ratmo came to the coffee shop to buy a cup of coffee. The gentlemen who were previously discussing fell silent and pretended not to pay attention. Why not brew it here, Mr. Ratmo, while chatting with us? Asked Miss Susie. Mr. Ratmo didn't say a word. He just smiled and left. The gentlemen who were discussing earlier remained silent and pretended not to notice. The person sitting there immediately touched their chest, afraid that their earlier conversation might have been overheard by Mr. Ratmo. Well, if we have to wait that long, it's troublesome, continued Miss Susie after Mr. Ratmo went away. But gradually, the villagers in Tegel Sari have become accustomed to Mrs. Ratme's ghost terror. Fortunately, since sprinkling salt, rarely any villagers come to her house, said Mr. Burren. It's said that those who are often haunted are the ones who had dealings with Mrs. Ratme during her lifetime, like Mrs. Lastry, until she intended to sell her house and move away from this village. Why is that? Asked Miss Susie. It is said that Mrs. Lastry is one of the people often visited by Mrs. Ratme's ghost, because during her lifetime, she had financial dealings with Mrs. Lastry. According to Mr. Burren's story, one night, Mrs. Lastry was putting her young child to sleep when suddenly there were knocks from the window. Immediately, Mrs. Lastry felt shivers, as she believed it couldn't be a prankster, since it was nearly 11 p.m. Terrified, Mrs. Lastry covered her face with a blanket. However, the knocking sound became louder, making her more uneasy. Please open the door. I want to repay my debt. Mrs. Ratme's voice was heard from behind the window. Mrs. Lastry remained silent behind the blanket, her body cold with fear. Suddenly, there was a strong, pungent smell of blood. Unable to bear it, Mrs. Lastry got up and went to the bathroom to vomit. While gargling, she faintly saw a head from the bathroom window. As time passed, the head approached until it was clearly seen sticking to the window. It was Mrs. Ratmy's head, showing a sinister smile with bulging eyes. The next morning, Mrs. Lastry was found unconscious in the bathroom by her child, said Miss Susie. Yikes, that's terrifying if it gets to that point. Actually, I also want to share an incident that happened to me last Friday night. That's why now I never keep the shop open until late at night, said Miss Susie. What's your story, miss? Asked Mr. Burren.